Somewhere in the Swiss Alps, a train is about to do something that shouldn't be physically possible. It's going to enter a tunnel, curve completely around inside the mountain, cross back over its own track, and emerge facing almost the opposite direction, all without a single passenger feeling more than a gentle sway. Sipping champagne inside, most guests never even notice they just spiraled through solid rock like a corkscrew. And that's not even the strangest part. Higher up the same mountain range, another train will climb to an altitude of nearly 7,400 feet, high enough that the air itself starts behaving differently, subtly dulling flavors and thinning oxygen, all while a waiter pours wine without spilling a drop. So how exactly do you build a railway that can drag an entire luxury hotel up and over some of the most brutal terrain on the planet? The answer involves over a century of engineering obsession, some genuinely insane construction stories, and a handful of tricks so clever that most passengers ride right through them without ever realizing what just happened. Let's climb into the mountains and find out. The problem mountains were never supposed to let you solve. Trains, by nature, hate mountains. A locomotive can only climb so steep a slope before its wheels start losing grip entirely, slipping uselessly against the rail like a car spinning its tires on ice. For most of railway history, that single limitation meant mountain ranges functioned as walls, barriers that simply couldn't be crossed by rail without some kind of trick. The obvious solution would be to build a straight track directly up the steepest part of the mountain. But that's exactly what doesn't work. Instead, engineers had to find ways to gain enormous amounts of altitude gradually, stretching a short, brutal climb into miles of gentler, winding track, essentially tricking the mountain into feeling less steep than it actually is. That single obsession, gaining height without ever feeling like you're climbing, is the entire secret behind how luxury trains manage to glide through terrain that, on paper, should be completely impassable. But the way engineers actually solve this problem is where the story gets genuinely wild. The trick: hiding inside the mountain. Here's where those spiral tunnels come in. And once you understand how they work, you'll never look at a mountain railway the same way again. Picture a train that needs to gain a significant amount of altitude in a very short horizontal distance. Instead of blasting a straight tunnel directly through the rock, engineers instead carved a spiral path inside the mountain itself. A tunnel that loops the train completely around in a circle while gradually climbing, so that it crosses back over its own original track, now sitting at a higher elevation, before finally emerging from the mountainside, facing a completely different direction than when it went in. From inside the carriage, the sensation is almost eerie. Passengers watch out the window as the landscape rotates slowly around them, sometimes glimpsing their own train's track running below them moments after they'd been sitting right on top of it. It feels less like traveling through a tunnel and more like riding inside a slow-motion corkscrew drilled straight through solid granite. This technique has been used to conquer some of the most punishing mountain crossings on Earth, allowing trains to gain hundreds of feet of elevation across just a handful of miles, all while keeping the incline gentle enough that a dining car's wine glasses barely tremble. What most passengers never realize is that they've often ridden through several of these spiral formations without ever noticing the turns are engineered to feel so smooth that the sheer scale of what just happened underneath them goes completely unnoticed. But spirals alone weren't enough to solve the mountain problem. The next trick required engineers to do something even bolder: building tracks that seem to hang in midair. Bridges that shouldn't be possible. If spiral tunnels solve the problem of gaining height inside a mountain, viaducts solve the problem of crossing the empty space between two mountains entirely. One of the most photographed examples anywhere in the world is a graceful stone viaduct that curves in a tight arc across a rugged valley, stretching roughly 140 meters in length, while standing about 65 meters above the valley floor, below tall enough that the drop alone induces a small gasp from most first-time passengers. The bridge curves so sharply that, from certain angles, the train appears to be floating in midair, disconnected entirely from solid ground, before disappearing directly into a tunnel mouth carved into the cliff face on the opposite side. These structures weren't built for spectacle, even though they've become some of the most iconic images in railway photography. They exist purely out of necessity, because building a direct route through certain valleys would have required either impossibly long detours or gradients too steep for any train to safely manage. The viaduct became the only realistic answer, a bridge audacious enough to make an impassable gorge simply disappear beneath the wheels. And once engineers proved this kind of construction was possible, An entire network of similarly audacious bridges and passes opened up across mountain ranges, once considered permanently unreachable by rail. But even with spirals and viaducts solved, one more obstacle remained, something that had nothing to do with height and everything to do with survival: the passes that almost weren't worth the cost. Certain mountain crossings required rail lines to be built directly through corridors so remote and unforgiving that construction crews faced brutal winters, unstable rock, and constant avalanche risk, just to lay a single mile of track. One legendary Canadian mountain pass became infamous during construction for exactly this reason, eventually requiring protective snow sheds and, later, one of the same spiral tunnel solutions used elsewhere just to make the route survivable for regular rail traffic. Other crossings required tunneling directly beneath a mountain pass rather than over it, abandoning a historic route that had operated seasonally for decades in favor of a base tunnel running far beneath the original summit crossing, allowing trains to operate reliably through every season instead of shutting down completely once winter snow made the old route impassable. What most people never realize is that many of these engineering decisions were made not for luxury or convenience, but purely for survival. The romantic postcard-perfect mountain railways that luxury trains use today were often born out of desperate attempts simply to keep a railway functioning at all, year-round, in terrain that seemed determined to reject human infrastructure completely. And once these punishing routes were finally conquered, something unexpected happened. The very difficulty that once made these lines a construction nightmare eventually became their single greatest selling point. When the obstacle became the attraction, decades after these mountain lines were built purely out of necessity, railway operators realized something remarkable. The routes considered too difficult, too remote, and too dramatic to build were now exactly what luxury travelers wanted most. One legendary alpine route has openly embraced the fact that it moves painfully slowly by design, covering roughly 180 miles over a full 8 hours, crossing close to 300 bridges and passing through more than 90 tunnels along the way. It's been proudly marketed for decades as the slowest express train in the world, a phrase that would sound like a failure for almost any other form of transportation, but here functions as the entire appeal. Another mountain crossing nearby climbs to an altitude high enough to rank among the highest railway points in the Alps, offering panoramic views of glaciers and high-altitude lakes that simply don't exist at lower elevations. And across the Atlantic, a Canadian luxury rail route intentionally operates only during daylight hours, ensuring that not a single passenger misses a moment of the dramatic canyon walls, glacier-fed rivers, and legendary mountain passes the route was specifically designed to showcase. What most passengers never realize is that the very slowness that once represented an engineering limitation has now become a deliberate luxury feature, proof that the industry learned to sell the mountain's difficulty right back to the people trying to cross it. But conquering the mountain itself is only half of this story. What happens inside the train, while it's climbing thousands of feet through some of the most hostile geography on the planet, is its own kind of engineering miracle. Running a 5-star kitchen at an angle? Try to imagine plating a delicate multi-course meal while your entire kitchen is tilted, swaying, and occasionally lurching through switchbacks carved into a mountainside. That's the daily reality for chefs working aboard these routes. Premium mountain rail services have solved this by building dedicated galley kitchens directly into specific carriages, complete with full staff preparing multi-course meals from scratch while climbing gradients that would make a standing glass of water visibly tilt. Staff have to secure cookware, brace ingredients, and time their plating precisely around the smoothest sections of track, all while maintaining a level of presentation that wouldn't look out of place in a 5-star dining room on solid ground. And at extreme altitude, there's an additional invisible challenge nobody riding the train ever considers. Thinner air changes how liquids behave, how quickly food cooks, and even how intensely certain flavors register on the palate. Just like on long-haul flights, some of these mountain routes are functionally serving food and wine inside a pressure environment subtly different from sea level, meaning menus and pairings sometimes have to be quietly adjusted specifically for the altitude of a particular pass. What most passengers never realize is that the smooth, effortless dining experience they're enjoying while gazing out at glaciers required an entire menu to be reverse engineered around the exact elevation profile of that day's route. And then there's the view itself, which required its own separate engineering revolution entirely. Windows, built to worship the mountain. None of this spectacular engineering would matter if passengers couldn't actually see it. So mountain luxury trains invested heavily in an entirely different kind of innovation. turning the carriage itself into a viewing instrument. Glass-domed observation cars now curve upward and outward, offering sweeping, nearly uninterrupted views of peaks, glaciers, and canyon walls that would otherwise be impossible to appreciate through a standard window. Some routes include open-air viewing platforms positioned at the rear of the train, letting passengers step outside entirely and feel the mountain air directly, rather than experiencing it secondhand through glass. These aren't just aesthetic choices. They're deliberate engineering decisions built specifically to make millions of dollars of tunnel boring, viaduct building, and gradient calculating actually visible and appreciable to the people paying to ride through it. Without these panoramic innovations, decades of extraordinary mountain engineering would remain almost entirely hidden from the very passengers it was built for. Which raises a fascinating question. Why go through all of this trouble at all? Why not simply fly over these mountains, the way almost every other form of travel eventually chose to do? Why the hard way became the better way? The honest answer is that flying over a mountain range shows you the outline of the challenge. Crossing it by rail, slowly, through carved tunnels and curved viaducts, shows you the challenge itself, up close, at eye level, unfolding in real time outside your window. That's ultimately what luxury mountain trains are really selling. Not transportation from one side of a range to the other, but a front row seat to one of the greatest ongoing arguments between human ambition and geological reality. A fight that took over a century to win, and one that luxury travelers can now experience from a reclining leather seat with a glass of wine in hand. So the next time you glimpse footage of a gleaming train curling around a cliffside, disappearing into a spiral tunnel, or crossing a bridge that seems to hang impossibly over empty air, remember what's actually happening beneath that beautiful image. Somewhere under those wheels lies over 100 years of engineers who refused to accept that a mountain could simply say no. And every time that train quietly rolls forward, climbing higher into terrain that once swallowed entire construction crews whole, it's proving, one smooth mile at a time, that no mountain range on Earth was ever truly impossible. It just hadn't met the right engineers yet.